apparent, so the model started producing bad optimizations and bad pricing, and it was a huge problem, but nobody noticed this right away, and it then went from generating millions of dollars of profit to generating millions of dollars of loss, and nobody noticed. So this is an excellent example, I think, of a model. When we say the forecasts, all models are wrong, but some are useful, this was actually a really useful model. But the problem was not with the math. The math was good, again, until it wasn't. And so what I'm going to talk about today is the fact that I think there are many other enabling factors around our models that cause the problems, and they're not what we typically pay as much attention to. And if we pay more attention or equal attention to model accuracy and model building, as well as all these other factors, we can make models more useful and adopted in organizations. So there's lots of good work on forecast adoption. In fact, I went to a great session yesterday on understanding forecasting in organizations, a project of IIF with Mike Gilliland and Spiros and Paul Goodwin and Len and many others doing great work. If you haven't heard the Forecasting Impact podcast, I highly recommend them. Paul Goodwin and Rob Heidman in particular had some great comments on how to make forecasting more useful in organizations. So I'm not going to repeat their work because that's not where I can add the most value. In fact, I will be the first to tell you I'm not a forecaster. When Mike invited me to give a talk, I said, Mike, you know I'm not a forecaster, right? Because I've known Mike for many years. What I'm going to do is zoom out to the bigger picture and again talk about these other factors that I think affect forecasting. So I'm going to talk about 3 gaps. 1, misunderstanding of forecasting's role in an organization. 2, failure to follow good analytical process. And 3, a lack of robust information. So just to give you a little bit of context, in addition to what Chris nicely said about me, I've been very involved in Inform, so I know the OR and analytics community well as I co-founded the 3rd chapter of Women in Machine Learning and Data Science, and there's now over 100 chapters around the world. So I'm involved in multiple disciplines and also across multiple industries, so that certainly informs my perspective. As well as personally, I live in the desert and love my cacti. The other thing I want to tell you is some stories I'll share from the company I work for, Kinaxis. We make supply chain planning software. This is not a commercial. The point of this slide is to let you know that we work with big brand name companies you've heard of. And so when I'm talking about the kinds of customers and prospects we speak to, we're not talking about little mom and pop shops. We're talking about companies like Toyota, Raytheon, Novartis, Procter & Gamble, Schneider Electric. These are companies that are big global enterprises with sophisticated organizations overall. Above the dotted line here, what that represents is these are companies recognized by Gartner as being in the top 25 for supply chain. So in other words, many of the leading companies who are considered really good at what they do. But you're going to hear more about how that doesn't always mean that they're applying neural networks in their forecast. To set a little bit of stage for supply chain, I like to, we have an academic program at Kinaxis, and so since the pandemic began, we've spoken to more than 5,000 students. Because when universities had to go online, people were happy to take virtual guest lectures. So I've given a lot of lectures to students over the last couple of years, and I always like to share a version of this slide where I help them understand the context of the relationship between supply and demand. So one analyst I know, Laura Ciceri, likes to say that demand has been like an elevator. It's either gone through the roof or gone through the basement. And in automotive, what's interesting is that in automotive, it's actually done both. So the beginning of quarantine, nobody was driving, everybody was at home, car sales plummeted, hit new lows. But if anybody's tried to buy a car recently, you know that they've gone through the roof. You can't get a car now. As this headline says, the market is insane. And not only is it insane from a demand perspective, it's insane from a supply perspective. Because historically, in supply chain, demand has always been hard to predict, but supply has been relatively stable. Stable's maybe a bit generous, but more stable, more reliable. But now supply has been even harder to predict. So the pandemic that began in Wuhan, China, the Detroit of China, now has shifted to problems being in the semiconductor industry. You can't build a car without a chip. So the point of this slide is to say that everything starts in supply chain with that demand signal. So forecasting is mission critical. But forecast is an input into a whole process. So in order to get us cars, toilet paper, bicycles, puzzles, games, whatever it is you want, in order to get all that stuff, We do need that demand signal at the beginning, but we have to balance the supply and demand and get it all the way to you, and that makes for a complex process. And the problem, the last thing I guess I want to say about that is that the problem has gotten increasingly combinatorial. So not only do we have the pandemic, that's obvious, but on top of that, we've had climate change causing all these crazy storms. Nobody knew anything about resin, unless you work in the plastics industry, but when winter storms and fires take out plastic plants, resin is in everything. We've had trade wars, we've had labor issues, we've had real wars that have an impact on so many different industries. So the combinatorial nature of these problems that makes supply chain ever more complex. Now, some companies are really good at this. Amazon has made headlines for their fantastic forecasting work they've done. And of course, their demand for their stuff shot through the roof, another elevator phenomenon here during the pandemic. What I would commend to you is there's a little story here at the bottom here, the history of Amazon's forecasting algorithm. It's a great little read about how they do the history of forecasting at Amazon. Pretty amazing stuff. They use deep learning, they use reinforcement learning, they're using NLP with transformers, trying to improve the accuracy of their demand signal. And when they started out with simple moving averages, they've improved the accuracy of their forecast by 15 times. 15 times, that's a huge lift to have gained through these various methods. But again, to illustrate my point, the math has been good, but what their model produces is estimates of high, medium, and low. And what their executives did during the pandemic is consistently chose the high estimate. And in fact, Andy Jassy, their CEO, said famously, "We made a decision to build to the high side to avoid constraining consumers and sellers in any way." The downside of that, regularly choosing that optimistic choice, meant that they now are overbuilt. So they've got excess warehouses capacity, and they're having to cut back in multiple ways. While at the same time, I saw a recent story saying that they literally have built a prediction that they don't think they will be able to have enough labor by 2024. Like they will have hired everybody they could hire, and everybody who ever wanted to work for Amazon will have worked there, and there'll be nobody left to hire by 2024. The point is that most companies, this is a company that does it really, really well, but most companies are not Amazon. So even these big brand name companies I mentioned earlier, most planners lack statistical foundations. I went to a supply chain planning, or attended virtually, a supply chain planning conference last year, and a very senior planner who worked at multiple big brand name companies, in other words, should have had lots of exposure over a long career and a broad career. Somebody asked her a question about Python, and she said, "What is Python?" Now, I would not have expected a demand planner to know how to program in Python, but I would have thought somewhere along that journey, that deep, broad journey, she would have at least heard about Python and know that it's some data science thing that might give me a better forecast. So the fact that she hadn't even had that exposure says something to you about the maturity in organizations. McKinsey reports that the most used, this is some documentation of what we've all heard, that Excel is the most used forecasting tool in the world. 73% of users. Now, they may use multiple other things, but still the most popular one is Excel. In terms of the adoption of machine learning in supply chains, the best estimates I've been able to find are two different estimates at 17% and 20%. And certainly our people who talk to customers all the time, I've got a couple here in the front row, say that I think that might even be optimistic, that everybody wants machine learning in their forecasts, but very few people actually are using it and would know what to do with it. So we have to mind the gap. We're in a time where forecasting is perhaps less well understood than ever before. So I said, I understand that we have one of Box's students here. I hope I'll do justice to him, but he wrote a paper in 1954, the one that we've all heard that quote from. And this other, he's often, the full value of what he said is often not given attention to. So I love this quote here, essentially describing a model. It's trying to simply express the underlying characteristics of the system. And the reason I point that out is to say that I think your average planner doesn't understand that a forecast is not saying this is what is going to happen. We're trying to mathematically represent what we think could happen to give a good estimate of what might happen. And the point is that the goal is not a forecast, the goal is to make a decision. I heard a recent interview with President Obama, and I liked the way he described this. He said that the decisions that landed on his desk were all the really gnarly, ugly ones, because if they were easy to make, somebody else much lower than him would have made those decisions. And so he would get these briefing books with all this analysis. He said, you know, the goal of the analysis is not to find a perfect answer, it's to eliminate the bad ones. We're trying to use data to make better decisions, but at the end of the day, we need to remember that a forecast is an input into making a decision. I think what happens is, in my mind, it's a little bit like if anybody's ever been guilty of, you have some big presentation report task you need to do, but instead you clean off your desk. I think that people fixate on the number because it's hard to know how to make the number and then ultimately how to make all the decisions. So they fixate on, let's get that number right, as if that's going to solve all our problems. So we need good numbers, but the number alone won't solve everything. Now, we know that Kahneman and Tversky helped us understand that people are far more irrational than we expect and that we don't understand. But I really like this recent IJF article from Fields and Goodwin, who showed us that, in fact, I think people are more rational than we account for, in the sense that their research and others over time have showed us that people ignore the forecast, they give overrides, they don't use it, they make these adjustments, they rarely add value, they definitely take time. Why are people doing this? It seems like irrational behavior. But their point is the incentives that they have in their organization, whether it be they're measured on metrics just for their silo, they want to maintain control, their political reasons, ego, whatever it is, people are acting according to the incentives set up in that organization. If we don't have good incentives set up, people will do what we pay them to do, which is they will act according to the incentives that are either formally or informally set up in their organization. So it's important to think about how do we set up incentives that matter. A second problem with misunderstanding the role of the forecast is what I'll call algorithm aspiration. This is when companies just think, can I just skip statistical forecasting? We hear this from our customers and prospects all the time. They're, again, these big brand name companies doing scary things on Excel, if that. And they say, well, I know we need to do more, we need to do better, but maybe we can just skip statistical forecasting and jump to machine learning. Because they have this idea that somehow, if I could buy a Honda, I wouldn't want to buy a Rolls Royce if I could. So they think that they're just going to graduate to the better approach. And machine learning may provide very robust information, but it's not necessarily better. So they believe that it can right the wrongs of forecasting somehow. Well, if the model's always wrong, maybe machine learning will solve all of that, it'll fix it for me. This is why, even though I said the maturity is low, the investment rate is very high. So lots of estimates around the investment rate and I call it machine learning, but typically the market calls it AI, but it's not really AI. I call it machine learning because I'd rather be more accurate with that. The investment rate is anywhere from 60% or more. It's really the driver of so much digital transformation that happens in companies. And so people are clamoring for it because they think it's going to solve all their problems. On the other hand, we know, I imagine most of you are familiar with the work from Dietfors, Simmons, and Massey around algorithm aversion, talking about the fact that humans are far more forgiving of what they perceive as an error if a human makes a mistake in a forecast than if an algorithm generated a forecast that they perceive as wrong. If the human makes the error, they have all kinds of reasons they can explain that away, and they'll still let the human make another forecast. Algorithm makes an error, what they perceive as an error, and I don't mean the statistical error. If it seems wrong to them, they think, well, the box has it wrong, it doesn't get it, I don't trust the algorithm, we shouldn't use this stuff. Woolsey and Swanson are academics from the OR space, and I love this line that they wrote many years ago: people would rather live with a problem that they cannot solve than accept a solution they cannot understand. And so interpretability is absolutely critical. One of our executive at one of the customers doing some leading work for us with machine learning said machine learning will not work without interpretability. Full stop. And I will say, I was disappointed. This is my first ISF, fabulous conference. I'm really enjoying myself. But I was disappointed compared to some of the machine learning conferences I've been to, how little attention, when I did a search on the agenda on interpretability, very few sessions on interpretability, trying to figure out how to make these models. And of course, lots of interest in machine learning, but how do we make those models more interpretable? We all know, we hear people say, when a leading supply chain executive I talked to said, I asked him from his perspective, what would he want a crowd of forecasters to know? He said, we have to figure out how to get people to trust the box. And in this case, I don't mean George box, I mean the box, the model, the algorithms we're generating for them. But in order to get them to trust the box, we have to invest in building trust. So that can be tools like interpretability if we're using more complex models. But even if we're using fairly simple models, forecasters need to invest in that trust, invest in helping people understand the models. Salespeople will adjust as they need to. Maybe we don't have enough product for their customer. They have to explain it to their customer. Give them an explanation and they will work with you, but you have to help them trust the model. Another way to help people get to trust the model is to involve all stakeholders. So, second gap I want to talk about is failure to follow analytical process. This chart here is from a Google NeurIPS paper from a few years ago, and it depicts what it takes to build a machine learning model and put it into production. What you're seeing here is all the steps involved: data configuration, the feature engineering, the model monitoring and maintenance, the infrastructure around it. I do want to highlight the fact that one thing to consider with machine learning models is there's a lot more boxes in a machine learning model, a lot more infrastructure required to bring a machine learning model to production. What you may not be able to see very well is the fact that the math is the very smallest box on the page here. And so I like to highlight the fact that the math is not the end of the line. What you're seeing here is the line, again, a little bit of a subway metaphor, is the 7 domains of analytics practice according to the Certified Analytics Professional Program. This is a certification program I've been very involved in, put out by Informs. Whether you're interested in the certification or not, I encourage anyone to take a look at this process because it's an excellent depiction of what it takes to do good analytics work. And what is described here, there's a full, I could talk for a long time about this whole process, but there's a full psychometric process that was undertaken. So what you're seeing here in the percentages is the psychometric estimate of the amount of time spent at each step in the process. I'm going to talk about each of them just a little bit. It's really important to start with, we shouldn't even start with the math. We should actually start with business problem framing, because we want to make sure we're solving the right problem. Is it even an analytical problem in the first place? Maybe we're talking about high volume, low variability, low margin products that don't need anything complicated at all to do a forecast. Business people will say, I need a forecast. Maybe they need a prediction. They don't really understand the difference. They don't know what they're asking for. They will describe symptoms far better than really describing problems. We also need to consider stakeholder analysis. When I said at the beginning, we need to build trust with people who are going to consume the forecast, those stakeholders need to be involved. We need to look at those incentive systems that Robert Files and Paul Goodwin talked about, making sure that those metrics are aligned and that we understand what they are, that we know the business benefits. Start out understanding that at the very beginning. And then analytical problem framing also includes the assumptions. I had the pleasure of sitting next to an executive from a large winemaking company, a big, not one of these small vineyards, but a big conglomerate on one of my very long flights here from Arizona. And he was telling me that they bought a big book of business from another winery, and after the acquisition, a lot of the assumptions in that data that they inherited no longer applied because they were assumptions built in when the company was running on their own, but once they bought it, those assumptions shifted. So a model's only as good as the assumptions, and if you don't know what the underlying assumptions are, that's a problem. Data. Data is a huge part of it. Any data scientist in particular will complain about the data. I like to point out that in terms of the steps here, what is most time-consuming? Data is by far the most time-consuming. One of our customers, Clorox, in fact, before they set about implementing a supply chain planning system, they decided to take a whole year to get their data in better shape because they knew how important it would be. And in a supply chain, it's called a chain for a reason. All the links are supposed to be connected. He pointed out the fact that when everything was siloed, the data, it didn't matter so much. You're not going to propagate errors. But once it was all connected, they realized how important it was going to be to have good data. Especially if we're thinking about machine learning, we need to make sure that we actually have enough data, an often overlooked factor. And what kind of shape is the data in? How long is it going to take? Do we even have access to the data? My prior job to this one was running an analytical team for a hospital system. Getting access to the data was very, very difficult. You need to really understand the business context. I love this story from Harry Mantelis, a supply chain leader at a company in the luxury goods space in Europe. And he said essentially that planners have a lot of domain expertise, and they have the ability to translate those numbers into stories for data scientists or planners or forecasters, however it may be. The point is that they understand what those numbers mean, and they can explain it to somebody who just sees it as a number. Because understanding that business context is absolutely critical. I noted that one of the tips that Rob Hyman gives for becoming a better forecaster is to really learn that business context. Linda Hill, a professor at Harvard Business School, does great work around the concept of contextual intelligence, the ability to understand that context around you. In fact, I often talk about the fact that with machine learning, one of the things it lacks is it cannot derive meaning from context. And so context is really important. One of our customers at Clorox told me that their business often doesn't understand that if you move somebody, a planner, from working on, say, Glad to Brita, different products, they have different assumptions underlying them. It takes them a while to learn that business. You can't just, it's not just numbers. You actually have to get the stories behind those numbers and understand that business context in order to maybe be able to make a good forecast. Now we finally get to the math. Again, I'll quote Box here, same paper. I love this line, simplicity illuminates, complication obscures. And then he goes on to talk about essentially beating a model to death. His words for it, that indiscriminate model elaboration is in any case not a practical option because this road is endless. In other words, beating a horse to death. So people may be fascinated trying to figure out if I can just reduce that error a little bit, get a little bit more lift out of the model, but it may so well not be worth it. I was interested to know, I've known about the competitions for years. I didn't know, many of you may know this story, but I didn't know that the origin of the competitions was that Spiros Makridakis had published a paper showing that simpler models often produced better results, and he was pilloried by his fellow academics, and he set about to try to demonstrate that using data that simpler models could produce better results, and he launched the competitions as a way to do this, and he did confirm this to me when I was talking to him a couple of days ago. So we need to remember that Occam's razor here, we don't ever want a more complicated model than the business value will generate. And in fact, that's because we need to think about deployment. So again, a forecast is only an input into an entire process. How many people here have heard of the Netflix prize? Few people. So several years ago, Netflix agreed to give $1 million prize to an individual or a team that can improve their recommendation algorithm by 10%. 10%. It was worth $1 million for them for that 10% lift. Somebody won. They gave about $1 million, and they never put the model into production. What they said is, we evaluated some of the new methods offline, but the additional accuracy gains that we measured did not seem to justify the engineering effort needed to bring them into production environment. Remember all those boxes on a slide I showed earlier? That's because the math's a little tiny part, and all those other boxes around it were going to cost them more than the value they'd get out of that math. I already talked about model monitoring and maintenance. What can happen? You can lose millions of dollars if you don't notice the model drift has happened. We also need to think about usability and workflow, not only interpretability, cannot say that enough, but workflow. How are we giving a planner information? Is it in a form they can use? And I don't even mean necessarily black box interpretability, but just literally, how is the information presented and where does it hit them in their workflow? Workflow really matters. If you don't pay attention to that, people may not use it. I've seen models that get discarded because the end consumers are not considered. Scalability is absolutely critical. I was just talking to Chris about, the scale of Google, but you don't have to be Google to have scale. That means that it really changes the way you have to think about your models. If you are in CPG or retail in particular, the scale needed to generate forecasting at that level is phenomenal. And so toy models that are good for teaching foundations to students are not going to, and they may even be useful for helping us explore new methods. They're not going to be able to be valuable in production in many cases. Third gap I want to talk about. So let's pretend that we've followed the 7 domains of analytical practice. We've built a beautiful model. It's perfect. We've got our forecast for how many vehicles people are going to want to buy, and for a given month, the demand forecast says people are going to buy 200,000 vehicles. The question is, as I said, forecast is an input into a decision. So how many do we make? We just need the forecast to help us understand how many we make, as well as things like, well, how many semiconductor chips do we need? How many bolts do we need? Which plants should we have open? What vehicle options should we build? How much capacity do we have? Which lines should we have open? All these questions. And then I want you to imagine that this forecast was for April 2020. Whatever forecast had been generated, surely sometime in 2019, whatever forecast it was would not have been right. We know that. And that's because microeconomics teaches us that information is never perfect. If we knew that people would buy 200,000 vehicles, well, we'd make 200,000 vehicles, right? But we don't know how many vehicles people will actually buy, and therefore we don't know all those other cascading decisions. And so because of that, supply chains have to constantly be in this trade-off between information and inventory, capacity, labor, et cetera. And so what we end up having to do in a supply chain is buffer in some way. Information is not as perfect as we need it to be, and so we buffer to absorb that volatility or that uncertainty. Supply chain resilience is all about trying to figure out how can we minimize that buffering, how can we minimize those trade-offs so that, because we know that demand is hard to predict, and then capacity, labor, supplies, et cetera, are constrained. So how are we going to do that? What organizations typically try to do is think, okay, let's just have more information. More information will help us make a better decision. So what they do is those spreadsheets that they love so much, they proliferate throughout the organization. You can see lots of silos here. You can see multiple ERP systems. When I talk to students, they don't understand why a company would have multiple ERP systems. And I have to explain, well, unless you're a new company, a Google, one of these digital natives, through a series of mergers and acquisitions and various history over the years, multiple customers we talk to may have as many as 10 different ERP systems. This is the chart I sometimes call the spaghetti chart, because imagine trying to make a decision with this kind of spaghetti, or another thing I can call it is a hairball. But this is, in fact, very realistic. This is a typical depiction of what a supply chain would look like. Hundreds of spreadsheets, literally. So more information is not necessarily going to get us what we want. We need actually to have robust information. So we need our information to be intelligent. But we also need it to be informed, immediate, inclusive, and to have impact. I'm going to talk about each of these. I don't think I need to sell anybody here on the importance of intelligent information, but the example I want to give and show how these trade-offs work, we were doing a demand sensing project with a large tofu manufacturer. They had a replenishment problem. In the short term, how could they bring in more signals into their demand forecast so they could figure out how to replenish products across their supply chain? With demand sensing, they were able to bring in more signals, which allowed them to reduce their stockouts by 60%, while also carrying 7% less inventory. The key here is that with more intelligent information, they were able to mitigate somewhat that trade-off and reduce inventory. So they didn't have to buffer with inventory as much. So intelligent information is critical, but again, I cannot say it enough, that information has to be interpretable because it's important to build trust and trust for adoption so that the stuff gets used. Again, thinking back to the Netflix prize or to that Google NeurIPS paper, that it has to be implementable. It has to be engineered to actually give us value. One way, there are lots of ways to talk about interpretability. I am not an expert in interpretability, but one of the methods that we use at Kinaxis is SHAP diagrams. For a planner, they don't have to understand, it was probably an ensemble anyhow, but what models were generating the signals. If we're bringing in machine learning signals to improve the quality of the forecast, all they have to do is say, okay, if the signal I chose is in red, it made the forecast higher. If it's in blue, it made the forecast lower. That's pretty interpretable. That can help them understand how to think about what signals they brought in and what value they're adding or not. The other thing that's important to remember is that local optima do not improve the whole supply chain. So I love this quote from Nada Sanders. Many of you may know her. She talks about the importance of having the whole organization connected, because bottom line, so many organizations are in silos. And if we've built a beautiful machine learning model in one silo, we have a perfect demand plan, but it's not connected to the rest of the organization. All we've done is built a highly efficient silo. And that's not going to get us where we need to get. Local optima. Second, information needs to be informed. The example I like to give is from the Suez Canal. Let's pretend that you had stuff on that ship. It was stuck. You have some sensors on your stuff in those containers on the ship, and the sensors are telling you, yeah, still on the boat, still on the boat, still on the boat. All you're doing is really just admiring the problem. You actually need to know not just that it's stuck, but at the time we didn't know, was it going to be 6 days, 6 weeks, 6 months before the canal opened up. What we really needed to know was, what's the impact going to be on on-time customer delivery? What's going to be the impact on production, given that these raw materials are delayed in getting to me? Whatever it is, you needed to know how to make those decisions. One example of this is a global pharmaceutical company, Ipsen, makes drugs for rare diseases, and they had a goal of having no stockouts, because no toilet paper produces potty jokes, but if you make drugs for rare diseases, it's a life-saving decision. So they could not afford to have any stockouts, but they had the same issues everybody else did in the beginning of the pandemic. They had up to 70% demand spikes because physicians were essentially getting their patients to pantry load drugs in case they couldn't get them. So normally very stable demand, they had 70% demand spikes, and then the same border closures, factory closures, labor issues everybody else had. They could look across their network and see, okay, demand is up over here, inventory is higher than we need over here. We could reposition the inventory, and as a result, they had no stockouts, but they also didn't carry excess inventory. Because they could just reposition the inventory and their data was informed, they had no stockouts. Third element of robust information is it needs to be immediate. So Unilever, this is an interesting quote from the chief supply chain officer at Unilever, Mark Engel, very well known in the supply chain field. At the beginning of the pandemic, he said, agility beats forecasting when the supply chain is stressed. And so in that kind of business, whatever your cadence was of forecasting, it likely shrank. So if you were on a monthly cadence, it probably went to weekly, weekly to daily, daily even to hourly, depending on the product. In supply chain, it's critical to know information as soon as you can, because you need that agility to absorb the volatility that you cannot predict. Procter & Gamble, it used to take them days. If, say, one of their retailers came to them and said, we want to do a major promotion on, say, Tide detergent, do you have enough for us? It used to take them days to answer that. Think that spaghetti chart. If you're trying to navigate through that spaghetti chart, that's why it might take days. When they had their information immediately and access through concurrent planning across their entire network, it takes them minutes to respond. It's even more valuable in a disruption, like a hurricane comes through, and they have been able to weather, pun intended there, weather disruptions very effectively because they can reposition inventory and avoid significant disruption. Information also needs to be inclusive. So again, I said local optima doesn't help it. We need to be able to have everybody who needs access to information to have that information. We need to democratize it and make it available to everyone and get rid of those silos so people can plan more collaboratively. Technicolor is a company that makes, among other things, based in Paris, and they make equipment for home networking. And they were finding that their salespeople would put in orders without any regard for whether or not there was the operational capacity to produce those orders and other equivalent capacity in their supply chain. So the rest of the supply chain got used to buffering with lots of inventory in order to make sure they had enough to make it happen. Once they put in concurrent planning, they could see the information across their network. They were able to reduce their inventory. There was a point in time that they measured from, I believe, the end of 2020. They looked at the Q1 2022, and they were able to reduce the inventory they thought they needed at that time by $120 million, because once they could all collaborate together, they weren't buffering with excess inventory. They were using robust information to allow them to buffer less. And finally, you need to make sure you're having impact. A supply chain planning leader I know worked at a company where her team, this gets back to metrics, her team exceeded all the metrics they had and did not improve business value. So it's important to make sure that what we're actually measuring what matters and matters to make impact. One of the challenges, the biggest competitor we face as a company is do nothing. Because companies stuck in that spaghetti world are sort of paralyzed by where they are, and they know they need to do better, but they don't know where to start, and so they think, well, it's going to take a big change, and so we don't know what to do, so we're just going to do nothing. Not very effective, but that's nevertheless what people do. But Merck, what they were able to do is, as long as they could give people this democratic information, give people access to the same information at the same time, similarly, they were able to reduce the inventory they were holding because they weren't having to buffer excessively. So finally, how do we close this gap? So I said that there were, one of the challenges is failure to understand the role of forecasting in organizations. We need to help the entire organization see have appropriate and balanced expectations of the forecast. 3 C's that I say are critical for that: communication, collaboration, and change management. As I said earlier, you need to communicate, help those planners understand the numbers they're getting, help them understand the value of that, and then the planners need to help the business understand what those numbers mean. Enable collaboration, and then change management is really critical. If we're going to bring in more advanced methods, even statistical forecasting would be an advanced method for some organizations, but especially if we're going to bring in machine learning and we want people to adopt it, we have to help them understand. I would argue that we want machine learning and more advanced methods not to replace the human, but to automate the tedious so they can focus their time on the exceptions that math cannot handle as well. And so we need to bring in change management to help them understand that and what their role will be. We need to invest in that trust. The downside, of course, of not following good analytical processes, if you follow good analytical process, you can make a big difference. And finally, those 5 I's: information needs to be intelligent, immediate, informed, inclusive, and have an impact. And finally, the third gap, I said I'd give a bonus gap. I would really encourage us to close the gap between industry and practice. I love this editorial from Files and Goodwin in last year. They had an invited editorial where they said that new research methods will get lost unless we researchers can demonstrate deliverable impact and benefits. So on the academic side, paying attention to helping us in industry with we have wicked problems in industry, big problems but we need to make sure that the methods help us have an actual impact. Often in industry, what we need are not so much novel algorithms, but novel applications, trying to take existing methods, apply them in new ways. For example, how do we forecast at scale? That's a big problem. We're forecasting, think about the big drive for sustainability, big issue in supply chain. How do we forecast for circularity? Not just how do we make stuff, how do we forecast for returns so we can bring them back into the cycle and reduce the need for new stuff? This chart here is from a paper from Mo Ansodi and Chris Tang around the ecosystem they call it the ORMS, the Operations Research Management Science Ecosystem. I would argue it applies to any academic system. And it's really about the fact that there's a relationship between the research community, the education community, and the practice community. There's a supply and demand side here, right? So academics often want data, they want to know about problems to solve. We in industry need the help solving those problems. We need the talent they produce. We need them to learn the skills that will be helpful to bring into practice. So it's an important way to think about the fact that there's an ecosystem, but it needs to be symbiotic. We need to communicate, find ways to collaborate. I regularly encourage industry people to work with local universities because it's a great way to build a relationship and make that tighter. With that, I thank you for your time, and I would say if any of you are academics, we do have an academic program. We've given, like I said, multiple guest lectures, case studies, and we'd be happy to work with you, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Why don't I open it up, Polly? One of the things we're looking at in IIF is trying to build more support for the practitioner community and possibly doing something like a certification program. Hearing what you've done in forms, I think I'd like to hear your thoughts on, for a forecasting community, what are the kind of things that we could look to do to have a certified forecasting professional? Think it makes sense, and how would you?
Good question. One of the things I would say, just as an aside, is that I've been very disappointed that at the little attention paid to time series, especially in these proliferating Masters in Analytics programs. I recently gave a talk at UCLA in their Masters in Analytics program. It's one of the top ranked programs in the world. Their time series course is an optional elective. So I was shocked when we went in to do a case study with them. It was actually a forecasting case study where we set up, pre and post COVID, trying to figure out, do a forecast based on quote, regular data, and then gave them 2020 data and said, forecast 2021, and they were like, oh, what do we do? But I was surprised to learn that these Masters in Analytics students who were almost a year into their program had not been taught even ARIMA exponential smoothing, nothing. And so I'll just say as an aside, pay attention to those Masters in Analytics programs. They're turning out a lot of students who will come into be data scientists who should be using forecasting, and they have minimal attention to time series. But in terms of certification, I would say I think it's important to pay attention to the larger process, because forecasts are typically, as I said, not used in isolation. They are often consumed by other models. That revenue management model I used earlier with the travel and tourism, you produce a forecast, but then you also have to estimate the elasticity, and then it goes into an optimization engine to actually allocate in this case, tickets for the program. So think about the fact that forecasting is rarely in isolation, needs to consider other models. So how do we make sure that we pay attention to that broader process around it? That would be my answer. Now you can go into more deep. One of the things Informs has looked at is, should we have certifications that are more specific? So you could sort of consider like an overlay certification for the forecasting specifics that somehow aligned with the broader certification. So you're not repeating something that's already been done, but saying there are specific things if you are going to be a dedicated forecaster.
Great ideas, thank you. Other questions?
Thank you for the presentation. I really like the part that you present the results in a way that the customer can understand them. But how do you track the level of understanding of the customer? And it looks, the SHAP value looks very clear to me. But if someone never stepped into a university, how does he understand?
A good question, and I don't have an easy answer for it. I can tell you that this same winemaker on the plane, just as a separate comment, I asked him, how does he feel about the demand planning team at his company and the results that they give him? And he said, they do good analysis, but I wish it was more interpretable. I didn't feed that to him. Like literally, I was shocked that he said that to me. So I think you're absolutely right, because I'm almost certain that in his team's case, they're not giving him machine learning models. They're just giving him, data and analysis. But how do you make it consumable? And so I'd say it makes me think back to a story. Tanya Balin told me this story. Someone Mike and I used to work with. Actually, Mike and I used to work with closely. A statistician who, when she finished graduate school with her PhD in statistics, she went to work for a small consulting firm, and she was asked to produce some report on some analysis she had done. She wrote the report, gave it to her boss. He said, too complicated, go simplify it. So she worked really hard, went to simplify it, gave him a second version of the report. He was like, no, you're not there yet, go try again. So she worked harder at it, thought she made it as simple as she could, gave it to him a third time, and he said, Tanya, I want you to make it so your grandmother can understand. And the reason I tell the story about planners turning numbers into stories is to say, everybody has their own expertise. When the pandemic first hit and the data was essentially useless, planners who really knew their space had domain expertise. They understood what's the market going to look like for Brita, and they could make good decisions. So they know their space. They're not dumb, but we have to figure out how to give them information given the training they have that they can consume. So I would say ask them and make that be a collaborative discussion around saying, how can we give you information you can understand? Explain them. Take the time to invest in that trust until you understand what they understand, and you can put it in terms they understand. It's a little bit like if you heard Yael's keynote yesterday, saying that we need to think about communicating uncertainty, not in ways that are essentially defending our own ground, but in ways that the audience will understand the uncertainty we're trying to convey.
Thank you, Polly. Very interesting talk. I have a rather specific question. So you were giving this example of the tofu manufacturer, right? So from a practical perspective, what are typically intelligent data sources that you make use of and that are also available to practitioners? Could you give some examples to make this more concrete?
It's a great question. So I'll work backwards. When you say talk about useful data sources and that are available, I remember talking to a very smart thought leader at the early days of the pandemic who was saying that people needed to bring in other signals. I was saying things like, well, what if we looked at, we had aerial images of border closings so we could see where there are delays at the border. I was talking to the person who was leading our machine learning team in R&D, and she was like, that's all well and good, but how do I get data in an API that I can consume and actually use on a and that's the thing people don't think about. So practical considerations are really important. We have, so in the models we build, we have some data sets that we buy and we bake into the system. So they're available, things like holidays, simple stuff, but I mean things like holidays or weather or market indices, things like that. There's also social media as a rich source. I sometimes expand on that tofu example and say, imagine that the tofu manufacturer, they make 55 different products. Imagine that a celebrity chef does a show on tofu, but it's only one of those products of tofu, tweets about it, and suddenly the demand explodes, but it's only for one product. You can use social media to bring in and understand those demand spikes and which product, in which locale, which demographics, et cetera. So social media is a very rich and interesting source. Product searches are another one we've sometimes looked at. Anything, I don't know if you're thinking about anything, Ruth. Anything you could get in a sustained way, but those are some of the most popular ones that we've looked at.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, I think that's all the questions. Thank you so much, Polly.